Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to Learning for Justice Summer Read Along. I am Kimberly Burkhalter, your moderator for today, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'm a Learning for Justice facilitator. I'm excited to be here to learn with and from our great panelists today. But also any questions that our audience may have, if you will please drop them in the Q&A section of the Zoom, which could be probably found maybe at the bottom of your Zoom screen or possibly at the top of your Zoom screen. Just to give you a little insight on the purpose of our summer read-alongs, they're definitely to deepen our understanding of article content that can be found in our Learning for Justice magazines, and also to really offer explicit suggestions and implementations for educators as you dive into the articles that you find in our magazine. And we also want to build a broader LFJ audience. So thank you for joining us. This is our second summer read along. Our article is entitled Going Beyond the Textbook. I believe Court is going to drop in a link so that you will have that for future reference. But just also if you want to skim as you're listening and you're learning with us today. I am joined by our expert panelist that I am going to introduce, but then I'm going to pause and give them an opportunity to share a little bit more about who they are. But first, I want to introduce you to Dorothee Benz, also known as Benz, preferably Benz. And so Benz, we're excited to have you with us today. Benz is a writer, organizer, a strategist, the author of this article that we're going to unpack and dive into today. And Benz has spent decades on the front line of social justice struggles here in the United States. She brings to us her expertise as a PhD political science, specializing in social movements. And she is calling in today from New York City. I also want to introduce you to our next panelist, Christopher Rogers. And Christopher is a co-chair for the Black Lives Matter at School, an organization that was, and Christopher, I just learned this, started or established in Seattle, Washington, where I'm calling in from today. And then later the movement in 2017, that was in 2016. Then in 2017, the movement grew and expanded in Philadelphia, where Christopher is calling in today. But Christopher wears many hats. Christopher is a youth organizer. Christopher is, as I said, the co-director of the Black Lives Matter at School, is the program director for the Paul Robeson House Museum. You got a lot going on, Christopher, and a lot of knowledge to share with us today. And so we're going to be looking to you today as another one of our expert panelists who talks about what you're hearing from educators who are and or want to go beyond the text when teaching honest or teaching hard history. And then last but not least is my good friend, my colleague, amazing panelist, and I'm a little biased here, but Courtney Wai. Courtney is a social justice educator through and through, a professional learning facilitator with Learning for Justice. Courtney brings to our conversation today, our dialogue today, a wealth of knowledge on implementation, what educators can do to go beyond the text, and facilitating the truth of teaching hard history. Courtney has been boots on the ground in the classroom and doing exactly what she is going to share with us today, what we can do to go beyond the text. So help me in welcoming our panelists. I'm excited that you all are here. I'm excited to be in this space with you today. I'm excited to be learning, and so I'm grateful and humbled to be the moderator. Audience, we want you to know that again, do have access to ask questions. If you're just joining us, please click on the Q&A on the Zoom link that's either at the bottom or the top of your screen. So thank you all for being here. Just briefly, I want to summarize, first of all, this article, which is a very inspiring, a lot of knowledge, gives educators a lot of agency on how they can go beyond the text. But just to give you a little bit about this particular article that is featured, as I said earlier, in our Learning for Justice magazine 2020 spring edition. It really is an article that highlights and focuses the voices of educators who are going beyond the text. They share their challenges, their resources, the wins that they're experiencing when students dig deeper, have inquiry, ask questions, and going beyond the text. It equips, prepares, and it gives educators, as I said earlier, agency to go beyond their textbooks when teaching about slavery in America. And it also allows these educators to highlight what they are doing to reframe the narrative. And so I want to pause right here. And before I move into the actual questions that I have for our panelists today, I want to give them an opportunity to, one, introduce themselves, and then we will move into our opportunity to hear from each one of them. I introduced you to Benz first. So Benz, I want to pause, give you this space and this place to tell us a little bit about who you are.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited we get to talk about this article, which was so much, I mean, fun's the wrong word when you're talking about slavery and racism, but like so interesting to dig into. I think what I want to say about myself, in addition to the generous introduction Kimberly just gave me, is that my roles as a writer and an organizer in the world are like intimately linked. I feel like I write to change the world, not to just hear my own voice on paper, so to speak. As Karl Marx said long ago, you know, the point is to change the world, not just to interpret it. I'm actually in a sort of an extended transition in my career. I left a career in the nonprofit and labor sector as a communications professional a number of years ago to focus on writing and to focus on work like this. So this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to be doing with my life. I've been involved in many movements, from the anti-apartheid movement to a lot of queer organizing, and in recent years, a lot of immigrant justice organizing. And lastly, I think I just want to say that it's really important to identify myself as white in this context, you know, because we are talking about the United States and the colony's history of racism and slavery, and I think that's just important. So thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much, and we're excited to have you with us as well. Next, I want to just lend this space to Chris to give you an opportunity to share with us who you are.
Yes, Chris Rogers, he, him pronouns, in this space primarily as, you know, a curriculum committee co-chair for National Black Lives Matter at School. But I got to give a shout out to Benz, because you came up with one of my favorite quotes. This book is from Ndai, who's an amazing West Indian third world organizer. The point is to change the world was the name of her collection, which came out a couple years ago. I'm really big. I was a pre-K through 8 librarian for a little while, pretty huge in collecting the text. But I really want to use this, you know, moment as introduction to affirm something that's happening currently in Philadelphia. But not just in Philadelphia, you know, I think, you know, we have shirts printed in Philadelphia that says from West Philadelphia to the West Bank. And I really want to lift up the ongoing struggle, the ongoing resistance effort led by Palestinians. Today in Philadelphia, we have an amazing rally that is being led at between City Hall and I think going up to our art museum, that is continuing to lift up the injustice of the ongoing and continuing and persistent attacks of Israel, state of Israel against Palestine. We at Black Lives Matter at school, we have endorsed and have continued to work with the Palestine Solidarity Working Group of DSA. And we put out this statement. I want to read just a part of it, right? And thank you, Brian, for these words. From SNCC to Malcolm X, to the Black Panthers, to Angela Davis, to Nelson Mandela, to Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. Black leaders and social movements have always stood in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, and they have stood in solidarity with us. In the words of Palestinian author and revolutionary Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary, wherever he, she, they is, as a cause of the exploited and oppressed masses in our era. So I just want to lift that up. I could not be there with them, but I continue to want to lift up the movement. And if I have some time, I'll put some links in the chat to continue to provide some education.
Wow, thank you so much, Chris. We appreciate your introductory. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you as well. On that note, Court, we want to give you some space in our Zoom community today to tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are.
Thanks, Kim. Like Kim said, my name is Courtney Wai. I use the she, her pronouns, and I'm a professional learning facilitator with Learning for Justice. Before I joined Learning for Justice, I spent most of my career as a classroom teacher and a teacher coach, and primarily here in South Texas. So I actually started my career in the Rio Grande Valley, which is, on the US-Mexico border. My school was less than a mile from the US-Mexico border. And then I moved here to San Antonio, which is about 4 hours north of the Rio Grande Valley. And, I think for me, a lot, thinking about this idea of like true history or honest history, I feel very lucky that the school that I went to, what I was taught by primarily Asian American Pacific Islander educators, which is very rare. And for me, I grew up in Hawaii. So, the town next to mine, which is where my dad, he immigrated from Hong Kong and moved there. I remember being really young and being like, hey, Dad, like, why are they flying the Hawaiian flag upside down? Why is it shredded? What does that mean? And it was a call for, Native Hawaiian sovereignty, right? And if you know anything about the flag of Hawaii, to me, it's very surprising as an adult, right? To see it, it's like, has like the Union Jack and it's very Americanized. And to me, I look at it and it looks like, it just reminds me of like colonization, essentially. And so I feel very fortunate because I had teachers as early as, middle school and high school and even elementary school saying, hey, let's look at this textbook. Like Captain Cook did not discover Hawaii, right? That's what the textbook says, but that's not true, right? To my 11th grade US history teacher who was like, the first day of school, we're not going to, I approach this idea of social studies and history as objective, right? It's not neutral, it's subjective. And that was like literally one of the first things that he said, and that was how he framed his course. And so, I feel very fortunate to have had those experiences. I got to take, Asian American literature, right? Which, I saw authors that looked like me at a very young age, but it also helped me kind of round out these other experiences where I was reading, the American literature canon, which were mostly white male authors, and contrasting that and feeling more connected to the Asian American authors that I was reading in this other class. And so I just feel very fortunate to have had those experiences as a young student of color. And that's definitely what drives me to be the educator I am today, where I am really striving to teach honest history and of course, learn and unlearn, right? The real history of our country.
Wow, thanks, Court. I'm sitting here thinking, okay, I need to fan myself. We have an amazing group of panelists here, and you all talk about just being honored to do the work of social justice. I feel honored just to be in this space and this place right now today. Powerful, powerful introductions. And yeah, thank you all so much. We're going to dive into our questions. And Benz, I'm going to start with you, but I want to grab a piece out of the article as I pose this question, because one of the things that we know, as I've read this article, I shared in the introduction, that this article really kind of highlights these educators who are going beyond the text, who are sharing their challenges, but they're also sharing their strategies. And they talk about the word that kept coming to me was reframing the narrative. They talk about reframing the narrative. And these are educators from all across this country. So as we think about this work that educators are doing every day to reframe this narrative, to step into the gaps, to prepare students, to prepare our children, the next generation, to be even bolder. You know, I think about my age now, almost 60, bolder than I was, and maybe the generation, but we're standing on those shoulders. Benz, can you talk to us a little bit and just share, why did you write this article? What made you want to write this article?
Well, so you just touched on a whole bunch of reasons for it, but let me step back and start by talking about the textbooks, right? The article is called "Going Beyond the Textbooks," and part of it is looking at what the textbooks do. I mean, as you know, the Teaching Hard History study itself showed, they are woefully inadequate. And I'll just sum it up by sort of saying a couple things. One, slavery is usually treated as like a standalone thing that gets a chapter, a half a chapter, or a few paragraphs, as opposed to being integrated into the history of the country. And the history of the country is the history of slavery and its aftermath, right? You cannot actually disentangle those two things. And then there's this charming habit of passive verbs for people who enslave others and who pass legislative acts enslaving others. That's always somehow without any agency. You know, no one is actively profiting from or, you know, doing the oppressing. And likewise, people who are enslaved lack a lot of agency in these textbooks. They aren't generally presented as fully human. And I don't mean that like, you know, in the way that they were in the 1950s, where it was just like happy slaves, but there's just agency missing, like the history of the resistance, the fact that people have always resisted, that's not really in there. And then the other thing, and I have to credit Nicole Hannah-Jones in the way that she talks about the contributions that African Americans, that Black Americans have made to the fight for democracy in this country, you know, as its primary carriers, like of that banner. That's nowhere in these textbooks, right? Nor is understanding the social construction of race, or the sequencing of slavery creating racism, right? You know, the etiology of like why you know, slavery didn't drop from the sky. You know, people actually made it happen. So it doesn't do, these textbooks don't really do any of that, and these teachers teach around that, and they use the textbook to actually teach around that in wonderful ways that we're going to go into. But the why of the article really is what you said, Kimberly, about the next generation. You can't possibly contest the injustices of the present unless you understand this history correctly. I mean, America doesn't make sense, you know, unless you actually really get this history. Everything from labor law, our lack of universal health care, you know, the Spartan public sector that we have. I mean, all of it is in one way or another related to that legacy. So understanding that and teaching that is really about teaching democracy and enabling, building democratic citizens of the future who understand the country enough to contest its injustices and hopefully take us forward. So that's really the why, and why it's, why it's so important.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Part of my thinking is in your why, and you're thinking about and your thought process in pulling this article together and writing this article. Definitely you had to identify educators that wanted to come forward and really speak to the work that they were doing. But I'm wondering, there's so much history out there. There's so much around this whole notion, this concept of why. And I'm sure you weren't able to put everything in the article and every person in the article that you wanted to, and everything that the persons said that you had an opportunity to plug into. But I wanted to ask you a question when thinking about not just the why, which is so big, but what parts did you want to get into this article, or things you wanted to express in the article that you were unable to do so? I'm looking, and it's a rich article of a few pages, and I know there's so much more. So what pieces for you did you want to get in, but you weren't able to do that?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because there is so much that I wish that I could put in this article. I just want to show you guys. This stack is the transcripts of the interviews.
Oh, wow.
It's so rich. It was like taking an entire course to talk to all these educators and hear what they said. So there were, there were so many just individual ideas, some of which are in the article, but like dozens more on how they teach around or how they teach with the textbook, using the textbook as a jumping off point, using it as a lesson in critical reading, like, what's missing in this story, so that students really start to, look at things through a critical lens. So there were lots of those kinds of examples that didn't make it in. And then there was the single biggest thing that I left out was a somewhat deeper dive into the Albemarle County reframing the narrative curriculum and their anti-racism policy. And I mean, there just wasn't room for it, because I had to sort of stay closer to the text. They teach all with an inquiry model, so I couldn't tie it close enough to the textbook thing, but it ties to the larger issue of what we're teaching and why we're teaching it. And what I really loved about that was the way those two things were connected: this anti-racism policy for their entire district, and this curriculum, right? So there's an explicit understanding that there is a normative value, that anti-racism is a value that we should be instilling in our children. We do it in our curriculum, and we do it in our policies. So that got left on the cutting room floor. They also have a really cool student equity advisory team, the acronym of which is SEAT, which the kids came up with themselves because they wanted a seat at the table. And as part of this whole project. So that didn't make it in. There were also, I will say, a ton of wonderful things that Christopher said that I could not fit in. And I'm going to let him talk about them. He talked a lot about the need to organize. He really made the connection from the classroom to outside of the classroom, being connected in the community, organizing, finding your people, being connected with parents, being connected with community. And he had a lot of great subversive ideas of how to, circumvent and stand up to the powers that be that are asking us to teach fiction, honestly. So I'll let him talk about that stuff.
One of the things that I'm taking away just from what you've shared, Benz, is that the work is happening. There are educators, there are districts that are going beyond the textbook, as you explained earlier, that is very limited and sometimes creates this fantasy perspective of the truth around slavery in America. So hopefully we'll get to see or hear from you as it relates to a sequel of this work. There's so much in that stack that I would love to hear more from educators, and just really the student perspective that you spoke to, and how students are getting involved and moving through this, which I think is going to segue me to Christopher, because I know one of the things he does is youth organization. But Benz, you have this stack of what educators shared with you, the work that is happening. And so I want to kind of hand this baton over to Christopher and really talk about, Christopher, what is it that you're hearing? What is it that you're seeing? The challenges or the struggles and the wins. What are educators saying as we think about going beyond the textbook, looking for ways in which to move students deeper into inquiry around the truth about teaching hard history? What are you hearing from educators?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your kind words, Benz. And maybe some of those things shouldn't be, publicized when we think about it in terms of the subversive strategies, right? Fugitive Pedagogies by Jarvis Gibbons talks about the subversive strategies that Black educators have taken up since we arrived on these lands. It's a great book. But in terms of what I'm hearing from educators, I think one is understanding that because of the, we had a very strong, decade of intense and somewhat historic racial justice mobilization, right? That wasn't, just solely focused upon, policing, but just thinking of all the, strategies upon which Black people can get free, right? So I think what we're seeing is educators who have found a hunger in that, right? Who have sensed that in terms of what materials they are getting through teacher education, spaces, or just in professional development, ongoing learning development, the ideas that are transforming communities and are not making their way in the classrooms. So I feel like first and foremost, for what we do at Black Lives Matter at school is seek to serve that need. We're seeing, and these are intergenerational movements. These are young people who are in the streets. These are people from all over that are bringing their knowledge and wisdom and subversive strategies to the table in order to transform unjust conditions. So I always like to start from a place where Black Lives Matter at school is that we are winning, right? In terms of delivering truthful histories that are engaging the most persistent and problematic and violent issues of our time, and providing true alternatives based on a history of communities, not just in the US, but from all around the world, who have confronted these issues and seeing those alternatives. So how do we recover that history? And with that, in that moment, we see the sort of like rising fascisms that are taking place and seeking to criminalize that knowledge and those people who hold that knowledge, right? So, I always got a book with me. So today's book, 4 Anti-Fascist Futures. This came out on Common Notions not too long ago. I highly encourage it. And it talks about, we're seeing an alignment against the momentum of trans and queer liberation, climate justice, migrant and asylum seekers' assertions of life against border imperialism, and indigenous peoples' demands for the return of stolen land. That, if you think about our movements in this decade, we have seen those really come to the forefront. So we are seeing, and I don't think, while I think it's important to highlight the way that the GOP has sort of like taking the lead in putting these bills forward, there's also a bipartisan sort of like hold in terms of saying that an alternative is not present. For example, when we have our current president Joe Biden, who's arguing for, no, we need more funding for police, right? And not responding to the ways that we even can rethink what community safety means. So I think what we see is educators that are both, in their communities, just as human beings, as parents, as caregivers, have navigating this sort of rise of criminalization strategies that we see moving through governments. But I think it's important, I always try to remind it when we have these conversations with educators, this is a reactionary response, that we are providing marginalized communities, people who are, vulnerable and precarious. We have a rising courage, a rising movement of folks who are willing to take chances to create lasting and just alternatives. So we cannot get lost in just fighting against that. We have to remember that it's about a love for us that really drives us. And with that, we can create movements both in schools, around schools, beyond schools, create schools that may not be called schools, that continue to, push forward.
Yeah, you speak to the notion we are winning, and we also know that this work doesn't come with challenges. It's not easy, right? Mm-hmm. And in the article, you talk a little bit about a backlash that teachers are up against when teaching hard history, and what educators are doing to defy this backlash. Do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, and Deborah, you help me out. I'm on my phone, so I don't have my computer. But UCLA just put out this amazing tracking project. It's called the Anti-CRT Forward Tracking Project. And what it seeks to do is map not only are we seeing state bills that are seeking to criminalize educators, create new sort of regimes of surveillance on curriculum. But even at sort of like the local levels, you're seeing book challenges, like in bans against, books that are speaking towards racial justice, books speaking to queer and trans self-determination. And that project, I think, does a great job of, like, you're seeing this rise. And in that backlash, we particularly, it's more pronounced in some of our sort of like red states. We're seeing teachers who are being pushed out of classrooms, and in some cases criminalized, because they are teaching, the seeds of content that shows what alternatives can be. And the thing is, the layer of it gets really for example, there was a teacher who was, we're talking for a unit about Ruby Bridges, right? Is under investigation. Teaching Ta-Nehisi Coates was like one of the best-selling books of the 2010s. It becomes almost, ridiculous in the types of challenges that are being made. And I think particularly from an organizing side, it becomes, the question of, from Learning for Justice and us and, many of our comrades, how are we building the type of support systems, right, that are getting on the ground, right, with these educators in these everyday struggles. African American Policy Forum is also doing a really great job of that too. So, there's a intentional focus that we have around K-12 spaces. We know it's also happening in higher education spaces. And it becomes both about how we defend one another, right? And defend our possibility to do this work, but also at the same time, continue to push forward and bringing truthful histories to the public, right? So, yeah.
You really opened the door for my question that I'm going to pass the baton to Courtney, because we hear words about criminalization of educators, books being banned, as an educator, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, right? Thinking about, okay, I need to worry about my job. I need to worry about what I can and can't teach in the classroom, but yet there's this article that's available that tells me I can go beyond the textbook. And so, Courtney, I'm so grateful for your expertise and your fresh perspective from the classroom on how. And I mean, how do I do this? What is it that I need to do? And so, Court, I'm going to pass the baton to you, as Benz has talked about why the article. Christopher has talked about what he's hearing from educators, the backlash, and so, Court, I want to toss it over to you and give you an opportunity to share with us what is it that I can do as an educator to go beyond the textbook that really doesn't give agency or space around the truth of slavery in America.
Thanks. And, I want to say that when I'm answering these questions, if you are an educator and you are subject to, some of these classroom censorship laws, I first want to say, like, I feel you. I live in Texas, and my classroom was actually impacted by, these so-called anti-CRT bills, where I had my students, I taught English as a second language most recently, and my students wrote these beautiful, PSAs about immigration and the reforms they wanted to see, right? Like closing detention centers, like, universal access to healthcare for all immigrants, including undocumented immigrants. And these were the things that they had experienced and they wanted for themselves. And that work got taken down. And I want to make it clear that I don't blame the district, right? The district was in a really scary situation, but like the district shouldn't even be in that situation where they feel like they have to take that down in the first place. And it was really disappointing to see the impact of that, right? That silencing of my students on their own perspectives. And in particular, I think about one student who she was in a detention center herself, and how hard it was for her to share that, how hard it was for her classmates who loved her to hear that, and that, someone was saying like, no, you got to teach both sides of that argument. Well, to me, because that's a Texas law, right? Like, to me, I'm like, well, that's just gaslighting her. Like, I don't need to show her these like racist, xenophobic narratives, when one, I'm like, she's probably already aware of that because she was literally in a detention center. And two, I'm just like, that's not the purpose of this classroom space, right? So I just want to like first acknowledge to the educators that I see you and I feel you, and it is really, really scary. And the good news is there are still things that you can do, right? And so I think the first thing is just educating yourself, right? Like, I am a product of the US, school system. So I myself didn't always learn the true history of this country. And so I had to unlearn the history of this country as well. And so if you are, a pre-service educator, taking ethnic studies classes, for example, I think is really a powerful experience for you. If you are a current social studies teacher, there are lots of great PD. I'm going to highlight Black Lives Matter at School again. They have tons of amazing resources that you can use. Teaching, or we have a podcast called Teaching Hard History that talks about, right, the true history of American slavery. And you can seek out PD opportunities. I think one of the really cool things that's happened since we've had a lot of schools have had to go virtual is just like a plethora of online PD that you can access from anywhere in the country or in the world, that I think is really, really great. So I think the first part is just, again, educating yourself. I think the second is, right, like now that you've educated yourself, you're taking steps to learn this real history, you do a curriculum audit. You ask yourselves questions, critical questions about the curriculum you're teaching. And so some things that you can ask yourselves are things like, whose stories and whose perspectives are told, whose stories or perspectives are missing or incorrectly represented or underrepresented. Speaking from my experience, I remember reading this, the US history textbook, and there was this literally a sidebar that talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it just said what it was and what the law was. And I was like, wow, like my history is literally a sidebar. It didn't even make it into the black and white paragraph, like the which made me feel like it wasn't part of the true narrative, right, of our country's history. And in that, and again, just kind of building off of what Benz and Christopher were saying, right, like there was no resistance, there was no resilience. I walked away thinking, okay, well, no one who looked like me fought against that, right? No one resisted that. And it doesn't talk about the solidarity of lots of groups that were against that, like Frederick Douglass, for example, spoke out against that. So none of that was included, and that was something I didn't learn until later, right? And so other questions you could ask are like, who's the author and why did they create this textbook, right? Getting to some of the context that Benz and Christopher were speaking to. Who could be negatively impacted by the narratives or the concepts or the ideas in this textbook? So again, I was thinking about Benz, you were talking about passive versus active voice. And that was, as an English teacher, a lesson I was able to do with a US history textbook with my students, where we looked at, essentially a sentence that was like, Black people were enslaved. And like you said, Benz, it's like it dropped out of the sky, right? Like there was no context for that. And what is the impact, right, of that kind of phrasing, right? And for me, again, as an ELA teacher, it's like, oh, that's such a juicy example of rhetorical analysis. But truly, right, when we change it to, white people enslaved Black people, for example, that has such a different impact. It lands so differently, but those words really matter, right? So again, talking about the impact, you can also talk about that rhetorical analysis. You can also think about, how do other texts or authors, right, present the ideas or the stories or the histories in this curriculum, and what messages, right, does that send to students about whose knowledge is valued? And I think finally, once you've done that, that's a lot of self-work, and then it's up the implementation, right? So how are you going to supplement the missing or incorrectly represented or underrepresented stories or narratives, right? Can you use art? Can you use primary sources? Can you partner with local museums, local community leaders, right? Because I think so many times as an educator, you're so strapped for time, but you don't have to be the expert on everything. And that's actually not your role, right? Your role is to facilitate the learning. So can you bring in experts into your classroom, right? Can you bring your students to museums, to sites to learn? And then of course it's how you teach it, right? It's not just about what you teach, it's how you teach, right? Can you teach in a critical way? Like how are you having students ask those critical questions, generate those critical questions, teaching in an inquiry-based way as another example, or just some concrete things you can do as an educator to teach the truth.
Thank you, Court. There's so much, right? And you and I had an opportunity earlier today to really talk about how do we open up this door to help educators have this sense of agency to go beyond the textbook. What we could be on here a lot more time, but I know our time is closing out. Christopher, I see that you have your hand raised. So
yeah, I just wanted to speak in an amazing resource. Follows up on what Deborah offered in terms of if you Google culturally responsive curriculum scorecards, you'll come to a project that was developed by New York City students, parents, teachers, and it's a full template about how you can do a curriculum audit. And it serves as an organizing vehicle to bring students, parents, teachers together to really look through what's being taught in schools. It's a really great organizing vehicle.
Yes, we have community agreements when we do workshops with educators, and one of them that stands out to me is unfinished business. This dialogue is definitely unfinished business. And Court, thank you so much. She's dropped in some links for folks to dive a little bit deeper into our dialogue today. Thank you, Benz. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Courtney, for just for gracing us with your knowledge and with your wisdom. We are going to continue our summer read-along programs. Let me get my notes here so that I can tell you exactly. And I think there is a link that's dropped in for the next one. Our next one is September the 14th. We're highlighting the article from our LFJ magazine titled Rural Schools and Hard History. It's probably going to be just as fiery and on point as this one. And gosh, I hate that we have to close out so soon, because I had another question for each of our panelists, but we're not going to be able to get to it. We want to encourage you to please subscribe to our Learning for Justice website. Where there you'll receive updates on webinars, on workshops that we're providing, have access to our free materials. Benz, I see your hands up. I am going to definitely get to you. But I do want to thank our panelists. And I really wished we had more time. I want to thank Sarah, who's kind of been behind the curtain, who's been our wizard behind the curtain, moving the pieces. So thank you so much, Sarah, who's trying to keep us on time. But Benz, I'm gonna get to you since your hand is raised before we close out.
Thank you. I'm sorry to sort of push my way back to the mic.
It's
but,
okay.
When you said we weren't going to do, a last question, I was holding what I think is really the key to the resistance to this, onslaught, and that is agency, right? And that's something that Christopher and everybody actually really highlighted in the way they talked about the work that they do. Teacher agency is the key here. You can teach around the textbook, you can use the textbook as a jumping off point, you can use other sources, but the key is you are a professional, you have knowledge, you have pedagogical skills, you have agency, you have an understanding of what should be taught. And that is what ultimately all of this backlash is trying to do. It's trying to de-skill teachers and take away their agency. And so I want to center that. And then likewise, student agency, right? The ability to think critically, the ability to develop the skills and the agency to be a full participant in society and to challenge the injustices in the same way. And it mirrors what's missing in the textbooks, the agency and the resistance of enslaved people, the agency and the resistance of our students, the agency and the resistance of our teachers. And that's the nugget I want everybody to take away.
Yes.
Agency is the key.
Yes, period, right? Period. We could put a period right there. I'm going to say amen. We started talking about agency from the beginning. Benz, I think that is a great closing to our conversation, our dialogue today. Thank you all so very much for just sharing your knowledge, your expertise. Thank you for bringing that to our audience. And I am so hopeful that our audience will walk away today exercising the agency that they have with students, with families, with community, in and then outside of their classroom space. Thank you so very much. Appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you in September the 14th at our next summer read along.